I'm your instructor, Andrew Joseph Keith, and in this lesson, we're going to talk about mannequinization. We will be talking about how to apply those principles to sculpture, and we will be building on previous lessons in the Figure Sculpting Fundamentals course. Mannequinization is the process of using simple, three-dimensional forms to construct a pose. The principles of gesture, form, simplification, and balance are just as important when working in the round. Mannequinization is no exception, and it is a great exercise for draftsmen as well as sculptors. When we're sculpting, we're already working in 3D, so the volumes of the figure are already there. So in this case, mannequinization serves a different purpose. It becomes less about getting the feeling of volume and more about capturing the primary forms using clearly defined planes. Being able to temporarily ignore the surface details and focus on the primary forms that make up the figure is a valuable skill. If you watched the lesson on the most common sculpting mistakes for beginners, you might remember that one of the mistakes is starting on the details before the underlying forms are correct. This exercise in abstraction and simplification will help us focus on the most important parts first. It also becomes easier to observe the angles of the pelvis, the rib cage, and the head when using boxes and cylinders. I used to believe that abstraction was just something that artists use that didn't have the skills required to represent the figure naturalistically. I've since realized that it's actually really difficult to abstract the figure successfully. If we're unable to simplify the complex geometric forms of the figure, it actually becomes really difficult to sculpt naturalistically because our sculptures will tend to lack structure. We've already talked about the lummus head, the egg of the rib cage, and the box of the pelvis. So if you've watched those lessons and done the exercises, you've already got a head start on the mannequin. If you don't know what I'm talking about, be sure to go back and watch those lessons. The process that was used to create the lummus head, the egg of the rib cage, and the box of the pelvis is the same process of mannequinization. We now want to apply a similar type of simplification to the entire figure. There's an infinite number of ways that the figure can be simplified and abstracted. We're not looking for actual plane changes on the surface of the body. They're not there. The body is more organic with rounded and soft forms. So we have to learn to take organic forms and transform them into geometric forms, where you can focus on large planes of the figure like the front and back plane of the torso. These geometric forms help us focus more on the planes that make up the primary forms of the figure. Remember that the shapes you choose to represent parts of the body may change depending on the pose and depending on whether the person you're sculpting is a man or a woman. Men might tend to be more boxy with sharper edges, while women often have features that are more soft and rounded that may be described better using cylinders. As you're sculpting these cylinders and boxes, think about how they differ from your average cylinder or box shape. For example, the lower leg could be simplified into a cylinder, but it isn't the same width all the way down. The widest point is about 2/3 of the way up the leg, and it tapers towards the ankle. Sometimes you may want to be more precise with some of the features. You can also curve the cylinders to better capture the gesture, like the leg from the side view, for instance. I like to think of these boxes and cylinders as if they were made of rubber or jello, so that they can bend and twist. By paying attention to the thick and thin areas as well as the gesture of the figure, our mannequin will feel much more alive. Okay, now that we understand some of the principles and things to keep in mind, let's talk about the specifics of this assignment. I recommend doing this exercise with a small armature, say around 6 inches tall, by using 1/2 inch scale for our cranial units and a thin 20 gauge aluminum wire. If you only have 12 gauge or 14 gauge aluminum wire, you may have to go a little bit bigger than 6 inches for the armature, but I don't recommend going too big because the larger it is, the more time it will take to develop. I could easily spend 20 plus hours on a mannequinization study, 18 inches tall, but most of you probably won't want to devote that much time to this, so doing it a little bit smaller will save time and save material. When sculpting small, it may be difficult to get the planes and surfaces perfectly smooth, but don't worry about that too much. This exercise doesn't have to turn into a finished sculpture. It could be more like a page in your sketchbook that helps you develop a different way of observing and representing the figure. Approach this study as we've outlined so far in the course. You can take your own references of a pose you'd like to mannequinize. So we're going to build a small wire armature using the technique in the lesson on building a wire armature for sculpture. Then we're going to capture the gesture with the armature, cover it with a thin layer of clay, start to build a skinny version of the mannequin with the lumus head, the egg of the rib cage, and the box of the pelvis. Then connect those forms using boxes and cylinders or a combination of the two. Once you've got the mass and the plane changes, take some time to clean up the study with your tools. If you find that you really enjoy this exercise, feel free to do it again on a larger scale or taking a specific part of the body like a torso and trying to mannequinize that. The portrait sculpting course has a lesson on sculpting the simplified head, which you might find useful, so check it out. This exercise can be time-consuming and frustrating at times, so don't be afraid to take breaks and go work on other things and then come back to this exercise. Don't stress. When in doubt, use your best judgment and try to have fun with it. While developing my own style of abstraction that I use a lot in my stone sculptures, I found that I would often have to sculpt the figure more realistically in clay and then study the anatomy and the pose to pull out some interesting planes and forms to make a successful abstraction. I learned that it is very easy to abstract the figure poorly, and it is very difficult to simplify and abstract in a way that adds to the figure instead of detracting from it. Remember, modification without understanding is distortion. Modification with understanding is elevation. In the premium course, I'm going to dive deeper into the purpose and possibilities of figurative abstraction and how it can help you develop your own style as an artist. See you in the next lesson.